Are we doing enough? That's the fundamental question of health and safety governance. And the answer, it seems at least in New Zealand, is largely not one that's given much confidence. And beyond New Zealand, the answer sometimes seems vague, unclear, or uncertain. Governance arguably is the linchpin around which all health and safety performance relies. So, there's something in this conversation today for everyone. Hey, it's Andrew, and this is Safety on Tap. Since you're listening in, you must be a leader wanting to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way. Welcome to you. You're in the right place. If this is your first time listening in, thanks for joining us, and well done for trying something different to improve. And of course, welcome back to all of you wonderful regular listeners. New Zealand has had its fair share of problems with health and safety. Catalysed by the Pike River disaster, new legislation was introduced in 2015 styled off the Australian harmonised model, and it promised to strengthen many aspects of health and safety, including better control of risk and clearer duties for officers of the organisation, as well as greater clarity to support regulatory activities. The sad news is not much is changing, with health and safety performance lagging in New Zealand well behind other similar regulatory regimes, including Australia and the UK. Existing guidance was created around 2015 for the new duties imposed upon senior managers and directors of organisations, called the Blue Book. It's clear that whilst that was well intended, it simply has not been enough, with the backdrop of tumultuous government policy for health and safety, constrained funding by the regulator, and claims of bare incompetence at WorkSafe New Zealand. The new Good Practice Guide for Health and Safety Governance was led by the New Zealand Institute of Directors in close collaboration with WorkSafe New Zealand, the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum, and the General Manager Safety Forum. The steering group was led by Chris Jones on behalf of the GM Safety Forum, and the lead author and expert advisor is Craig Marriott, both of whom who join me in today's conversation. Chris Jones is an experienced strategic health and safety leader, having head of health and safety roles in both the UK and New Zealand, in the rail industry, prisons and corrections, and now at global dairy giant Fonterra. He has also worked in health and safety lead roles within the New Zealand government and a swathe of industry, regulatory and expert advisory groups, as well as government consultative committees. Chris is fast becoming one of the most popular health and safety speakers in this part of the world as well. Craig Marriott is currently consulting under his own brand, having most recently been the General Manager HSEQ at First Gas, as well as the chairperson of the Safety Innovation Community in New Zealand. With a background in high hazard industries, things that really go boom, and the regulation and creation of safety cases in both the UK and New Zealand, Craig's experience spans both senior health and safety positions and a diversity of consulting leadership roles. Craig is both a keynote speaker and author of Challenging the Safety Quo. Chris and Craig are arguably two of the most well-known and well-respected senior health and safety professionals in New Zealand today, and both have spent time working in senior roles at WorkSafe New Zealand. It's no wonder that they've been able to bring their knowledge and leadership to this impressive piece of work on health and safety governance, along with a committee of clever and hardworking colleagues. Let's talk health and safety governance with Chris Jones and Craig Marriott. Chris Jones and Craig Marriott, welcome to the Safety on Tap podcast.
Thanks, Baz.
Now, we're here talking about the relatively new, hot off the press health and safety governance document, which you've called a Good Practice Guide, or what Australians might call workplace health and safety due diligence. It's been a while since we've had two people on the podcast, and you guys, I think, are in a pretty important double act in the sense of your role, Chris, as the chair of the process or the working group that brought all of these stakeholders together to deliver this piece of work. And Craig, you've had your sleeves rolled up elbow deep in the detail of this as the lead author and expert advisor. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this conversation about what the guide is trying to do how you went about creating the guide and the kind of change that it's seeking to make. So, Chris, I might begin with you. The Institute of Directors in New Zealand published quite some years ago the Blue Book, which was a health and safety guide for directors. What's different about this guide this time around?
Great question. Maybe a bit of the context, Baz, might help. So the genesis of the work really came about from a group that myself and Craig were members of. I still am. Craig has moved on, called the General Manager Safety Forum, which is a collection of senior safety leaders in New Zealand who are trying to collectively improve outcomes. And we were looking at what a pretty flatlining fatality rate. And we were asking ourselves the question, where do we as a group want to focus our effort over the few years? And we chose 4 kind of big buckets. And a few of us, myself, Craig and Greg Lazaro, very much felt like governance was a core part of driving better safety performance and safety outcomes. And so we said, okay, well, how are we going to improve that? We knew that at the moment there's big focus on kind of compliance. And so we as a group went away and started to think about who else needs to be part of this, which I know we'll get into in our conversation. But as we worked through the process, and it was myself, it was Craig, it was Greg, but there's also people like Mike Cosman and Francois Barton, which we can talk about as we go through. One of the things we knew is that the Blue Book, as it was colloquially kind of referred to, which is the IOD and WorkSafe existing good practice guide, was generally viewed as something that was driven through quite a compliance mindset. So it was created in 2016, just as the brand new health and safety legislation, which is based on your Model Act, coming into being. And so the big focus at that time was just give clarity to directors and officers and executives about what due diligence is. And it filled a necessary void, but the void got filled by something that many of us felt was quite a compliance agenda. And also it was a guide that asked some interesting questions, but didn't really give a sense of what good looked like. And so this new guide really tries to address that. So what is different about this new guide? I'm interested in Craig's kind of perspective. We've been on this now for 4 years together. The new guide is purposely not driven by compliance. So it is much more about driving curiosity and good governance than it is purely about due diligence. Due diligence is part of it, but it's not the sole purpose of what we're trying to do. The new guides is based around what I think are more contemporary models of safety that we as safety professionals are familiar with than maybe the governors of our organizations are. So at the heart of our framework that we created is, resilience engineering is in there, front and foremost. We've got human performance is in there. We've got input, or not input, but inspiration by thought leaders like Greg Smith. So I think what you see is something that's more reflective of what we as a professional community would see as good versus what's quite compliancy. And then as I mentioned, the last guide didn't really describe what good actually looks like if you're a governor of an organization. Whereas this guide really steps into that space and it is much clearer on this is what good should look like if you're asking these quite searching questions. Apology, long-winded answer to a really good question, but that context maybe gives a sense of some of the shifts that we're looking to make. Craig, I don't know, does that kind of reflect your thought?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the background to it and the intent. And I think the other intent, what we recognized as a GM safety forum, we're not the drivers of governance. The directors are the drivers of governance, and chief executives are heavily involved. So, which is why we joined forces with the IOD and with the business leaders health and safety forum to make sure that we've got all those views input. But we wanted to make sure that everybody was thinking the same things. So the feedback was that directors told us, they struggled to get the right information that they wanted from the organizations, and health and safety managers told us that, the board don't listen to me, or they're not, or they're asking the wrong questions. And so that was the sort of the idea behind those kind of core principles, which is because everybody's got that different perspective. If we have that set of core principles that everybody's working from, then even if your perspective is a little bit different because of your own context, at least we're all got that same core that we can come back to. And so it was about balancing all the components of that governance ecosystem, as well as the sort of technical component of just making sure they know what a good answer looks like to them.
Yeah, it makes sense. And having looked at the Blue Book and the new and improved guide side by side, I can certainly see some what I would describe as significant shifts in language and in content. I mean, you used the word vision in the guide, which again is one of those words that really jumped out at me that you wouldn't ordinarily see in a thing like this. So, Craig, I'm really interested. You mentioned there a couple of different stakeholder groups. And I imagine that you had the hardest job of all, which is trying to juggle everyone's interests and probably not getting a whole lot of specific feedback until you had words on page, and then they would red pen the whole thing. So I'm really interested to understand, Craig, what was your experience like taking into consideration the stakeholder views? How did you go about doing that voice of customer piece, and who is customer, or who are the customers of the Good Practice Guide?
Yeah, the customers, I think, are all of those different people I mentioned before, all of those different stakeholders in that ecosystem. So executive management, directors, and obviously health and safety leads as well, which is why we've put it together in the way that we have. But what we did was, the first thing we did was we ran some workshops.
Mhm.
So we ran, I think, half a dozen workshops around the country. Some of those were focusing on the kind of the technical detail. What do people think is working? What isn't working? And then others were more around the broader context piece. What the governors and officers feeling about next steps, where they need to be going, are they comfortable with what they're doing? So we made sure we got all that feedback coming through. And then we also had a whole pile of one-on-one discussions with people, or just a couple of people on sort of Zoom calls and things like that. And I think Steph, who project managed the project for us in the early days, I think her stakeholder list got over 1,000 people in the end that we were sort of sending things out to. And as we went through the drafting process, we sort of shared the draft with a few people, got feedback, the standard approach to it. But interestingly, that there was very little by way of pushback in terms of this is the sort of thing we want to do. Everybody was pretty much on the same page that, this isn't working as well as it should. We need to do something a little bit better. And the other interesting thing was, particularly from the director side, was, this is really it's not just a safety question. This is a broader governance question. So the same things that we're talking about in this context, which is, maybe directors don't have enough knowledge of what the business does at the front line. They said that's not just a safety issue, that's a broader governance issue. And so, they really stepped into it. And the other thing we did with those workshops was we deliberately made sure that we mixed up the directors and the management and the safety people. We didn't do them.
Okay.
Because one of the things that we were concerned about was that your director, because normally the only people they hear from are their own organization, and there's the dynamic there that maybe stops people being quite as brutal as they might need to be in some of that feedback. And so it's probably the first time that they've spoken to safety leaders from different organizations that are free to sort of share their thoughts and ideas. So that, I think, helped a lot get that dynamic and that mix of people.
And I recall, because as we went through that, Craig, and it was still around the COVID kind of period. We kicked this off in like early 2020-ish, right? So dynamic.
Good timing, guys.
It made it challenging. But I recall, for me, I think there were like 8 big takeaways, Baz, that I heard as we went through this process, right? Loads of people engaged, loads of things. So, we heard things like there was confusion about, like, at an officer level about what is my role versus the PCBU. And so many of the officers we were talking to, and we were asking them, what's your role in health and safety? What they played back to us was actually the role of a PCBU. There was a fear of, my job is to stop people being harmed, and I'm worried that if people are harmed, they're going to go to jail, rather than that clarity of my role is about due diligence. So, that was a really interesting insight. We picked up that, there's a sense that officers were viewing health and safety as a complicated problem rather than the complex issue that we see it as today. And so, bringing in that, my view is bringing in a more finance lens where there's absolute certainty about numbers and confidence around that, rather than the complexity situation that we know safety is an emergent issue of. Big focus on compliance and transacting things, a big sense of what's the tick list of stuff that everyone else is doing, and can we just say that we've done what others are doing? Have we done enough? There's a theme around, a scarcity of really governance capable health and safety leaders. And I think we as a profession have kind of had to step back and realize that actually we do need to invest in ourselves, the ability for ourselves as a profession to operate at the board level and understand what it's like to be a board member. That came through quite loudly. We can talk about this a lot more, but definitely a reliance on lag data driving, reactive responses to events. And what was interesting is even those directors who said, look, I know that TRIFA isn't adding value, they were still really reluctant to let go of it. There was something around directors not feeling able to be genuinely vulnerable about themselves amongst their peers. So, the ability to say, actually, I just don't know enough about this topic, which then limited the curiosity. Really unclear governance capability requirements for health and safety. So, when we ask, well, what does good governance capability look like, from a health and safety lens, it was just all over the place. It was either loose or it was light. And then finally, and again, Craig and I spent a lot of time talking about this with others, but just a lack of clarity from our regulator in New Zealand about what are their expectations, but also what is their capability? What is the capability of an inspector for our main regulators to be able to actually go and engage at a board level? So for me, I don't know, Craig, if they do, Nate, but I was reflecting, they were like 8 big things that I remember hearing as we did all of these workshops and spoke to those, that 1,000 people. That was the problem statement, or they were the problem statements that we were really grappling with when we were looking at this work.
Yeah, that's a really nice list, Chris. And the regulator thing is interesting. We use words like courage in here and care, and those aren't typical regulatory words. So credit to WorkSafe for sort of, big supportive of this, using some of those kind of slightly difficult to define terms and not maybe normally in their wheelhouse. But getting the regulator on board was absolutely crucial. We didn't want to go in, be advising boards on what they should be doing, and then have the regulator come in and asking for a whole different set of information. Because otherwise that completely blind everything that we're doing. So that was something that we did right from the start. And of course, WorkSafe did fund the project. So kudos to them for being proactive in helping us deliver it all.
Let's pick up on some of that language. We'll get into the guts of the guide in a minute. So don't feel like this is your opportunity to go into the 5 C's, 6 C's. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 5. I'm sorry. So let's not go there yet. But you mentioned some of those words: courage, curiosity, context, and care. I think capable is the other word. No surprises there. But I think 4 out of the 5 of those words are words that most of the stakeholders, I would think, involved in this process would kind of go and cock their head a little bit and go, that's different. So tell me a little bit, again, we'll dive into the detail in a minute of those, but just at a high level, tell me a little bit about what kinds of ambitions you had and what kind of intent you had in introducing new and maybe, I don't know whether risky is the right word, but I mean, courageous. You used the word courageous in there as well. So tell me a little bit about what your discussions were like when maybe you two were getting your heads together and whiteboarding or whatnot. And like, at what point in time did you go, I think we can do that, or I think we should do that? Or were there times when you thought you got right to the edge of what was going to be palatable for your audience? Tell me a bit about what was going on in your minds.
Interesting that you said while we had our heads together whiteboarding, because it was actually, in a session whiteboarding where those 5 C's emerged. So they were an emergent outcome of our conversation. So when we were running those workshops and having those feedback sessions, we got a lot of feedback from people saying things like, it's fine putting all this stuff in, but if you haven't got a board member who's genuinely interested, then you're not going to get anywhere. And if you haven't got a board member who's prepared to have courageous conversation, who's prepared to say, look, I don't know the answer here, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so we got a lot of that behavioral feedback. The principles was something that we sort of picked right from the start as these are something we can build things around. those behavioral components, the how you do it, very much arose from the conversation that we had with people as things that they said were really important to make it effective in practice.
Yeah, and it's a good opportunity to maybe also give credit. So it was a whiteboard session. We have many of those. But it wasn't just myself and Craig. So we had an awesome bunch of, a small group of us who really led this work forward. So Mike Cosman, really well-known safety expert over in New Zealand, was part of the original task force review off the back of Pike River. We've got Francois Barton, who's the executive director of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. We had Greg Lazaro, who at the time was the tier 2 leading health and safety for New Zealand's transport agency. He's headed back over to Australia now. He's an Aussie. And we had Steph Coops, who was our project manager. So, keen to make sure that they also get the credit, because it was a small group of us who were really spending a lot of our time. I think Greg's point is really good, that the behavioral bit popped out of the engagements we did. I do think we purposely recognized the need for something different when it came out. So if it came out and it was just ever so slightly different to the Blue Book, then we just didn't think that we would be doing it justice or driving forward. So why did we end up in some of the more brave words around courage, etc.? Well, that's because we needed to do something different, and this is what people told us. The principles and the activities, I think that was a really good kind of meaty theoretical conversation where we were grappling with models. So we were looking at, you've got due diligence in the law. That's the kind of basis. But that's what the Blue Book was kind of codifying. But then a lot of us were spending our time talking about, resilience of organizations. We were going through COVID and asking ourselves, how the hell had we not anticipated a global pandemic better? How were we not set up to respond better? Why have we not learned from previous ones? And so we started to look at Holnagel's resilience engineering. Many of us have been kind of in that space for a while, and we're saying, well, what does that offer us to get really curious about?
Yeah.
And then, people like Greg Smith have been out with, Paper Safe at the time and reading a lot of the great stuff in there. So there were a few models that were kind of skirting around. I remember, Craig, having a whiteboard session in Wellington where we were putting up these different frameworks, and we were saying, well, what's the commonality across them? And that's how we kind of ended up with these principles and activities, the what you do, learn and develop, which we'll get into. But the genesis was us trying to say, we can't ignore due diligence and the legislative framework that guides our officers. But that is also it's quite different to the sorts of concepts and models that safety people are talking about these days. And it will put an organization in a place where you can succeed rather than just try to stop bad things happening. And it was probably the conflation of a few of those on a whiteboard that led us to the model. Craig, is that your kind of memory of it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as I said on a post I put in on LinkedIn yesterday, that it wasn't deliberately finding 5 words that began with C. We did literally just, we highlighted, circled that one, figuring out, well, I've done it. Fantastic.
No marketing people involved.
Yeah.
So tell me then, there's a couple of thoughts that are coming to my mind here. One is the Trojan horse for change. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is the courage of leadership coming out of the health and safety space, and the Health and Safety Leaders Forum, which is, for people who don't know, is executives who are deciding to be present and visibly committed to health and safety and collaborate with each other. It kind of makes me think that, well, the Institute of Directors and that director community probably weren't waking up in the morning and feeling uncomfortable in cold sweats about, this stuff. I guess that it probably wasn't at the top of their list. And you've got a regulator who is on public record and in the media as having been through what kindly might be described as tumultuous times, what maybe more cuttingly might be described as incompetence and sheer underfunding, so inability to actually do their job. So I can imagine that you've also got this tension that as a group you've got to manage, which is, well, holy moly, like when the fatalities happen and the prosecutions start, because make no mistake, that's the context that we're operating in here, then this piece of work is going to get tested. It's going to get put through the ringer. So tell me a bit about if we've just spoken about, the values embedded in this, the alignment of stakeholders and the vision you wanted to create, let's maybe flip that around and go like, how did you envision how this is going to work when unfortunately, there are lives lost or harm happening and real directors in the dock?
Yeah. And interestingly, I was actually an expert witness in a due diligence trial quite recently. And one of the things that I would look through in there was what guidance is available for officers, because the test is what would a reasonable officer do, and part of that is, well, what are the understanding of what the obligations are, and outside of that blue book, there is basically nothing beyond just a regurgitation of the act. Yeah. There's virtually been no case law on sort of large corporate yet. It's all been small owner operator type businesses on the whole. So I can't say that was at the forefront of our thinking when we were developing this. We were sort of trying to avoid that compliance conversation. But having been through that process, I actually think this will be really, really helpful in that space, because so much of the discussion was, well, is what you did enough, or is what you did the right thing? And now we can point to that and say, well, actually, look, this is what it says you should be doing, and this is what it says you should be looking for. And I think there's enough technical detail in there to be able to support those kind of conversations.
So the Trojan horse comment then on my mind is this idea that if we were to draw a causal loop diagram or like a systems thinking kind of picture of this whole piece of work, zooming out from just the guide itself, I can see the elegance in this, in the sense that you have some forward-thinking leaders who are integrating different ideas and disciplines, who are looking forward rather than looking back, which is so often the anchor for us in health and safety. And you're using the due diligence and governance principles to provide guidance, which effectively the only conclusion for a competent director would be, well, this new guidance is out there. My defense will be that I have acted in accordance with the guide in exactly the same way that a director, is entitled to rely on competent advice and to verify the appropriateness of that. So it's almost like you've sewn the whole thing up quite beautifully and tightly so that what else would directors do apart from understand this process and use it? And then that leads to the structure of the content, which is that you, I think, have been, again, quite courageous and specific in how you've put into the document. So I'm going to pause there because that was a word salad. Trojan horse and sewing it up. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And then maybe we can get into the how part.
Great. You brought me a bit in the middle of that, Andrew. I'm not sure what you said. You said sewed something and then you broke up quite a bit.
Sewed it all together, the threads of this and the different pieces of fabric. That was kind of the image that came into my mind, that you pulled the threads really tight on this so that what director wouldn't be going through this with a fine-tooth comb and using this guide as a defense or like anticipating that it becomes part of their defense. It's almost beautiful in its simplicity. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and Brent Sutton's been talking about this concept of a Trojan mouse, which is something, quite small that you get in to do that kind of thing. I think we're quite a long way from the more a Trojan elephant, to be honest. It's a case of, look, this is here, this is what it's supposed to be. We make a big song and dance about it, and that's going to be the core thing that you need to rely on. There's still a whole part of stuff about how do you operationalize some of these things? How do you get the systems behind them to make sure they're consistently applied and all those kind of things? But in terms of, to me, it's intended to be full front and center rather than a sort of a Trojan horse.
Hey, it's Andrew with a quick reflection about performance. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, I wish I had a coach for work. So it's pretty normal that coaching isn't a concept that's on your mind. What I do know is from working with hundreds of health and safety professionals, what's more likely to be in your mind are the frustrations you might be feeling about making change, or the doubts you have about your ability to step up, or concerns you have about the capability of your team to better service the needs of your organization. Or maybe you're excited but unsure about your new promotion, that expanded responsibility, or how in the heck you'll develop and deliver that new health and safety strategy. These are the everyday things in the game of health and safety practice. Some good, some not so good. A coach is not on the field of play with you. They don't pass you the ball and tell you what to do. A coach helps you be ready for the game, to prepare a plan, to develop the skills or the capabilities for the next challenge, and support you through the losses as well as the wins. Coaching is not evaluated on your participation or the time spent. Coaching is only evaluated on its outcomes for you, and they can be pretty awesome. Coaching is one of the most effective forms of professional development I've ever seen. I have a long list of stories and people who I can put you in touch with to tell you exactly how they've benefited from coaching with me. And it's a pretty smart investment in valuable resources for you and your team. If you want to explore how coaching might help accelerate you and your team's success, visit www.safetyontap.com/curious.
Yeah, awesome. I agree. I think, look, firstly, you'll still see in the guide that it does say you still need to take, your own legal counsel. You still need to think about your context. So, we don't paint this as do this and X. There's, I think, sufficient clarity in there to give really good guidance. But to Craig's point, how you bring that to life is still a core kind of level of detail. And we're just about to have a session as a GM Safety Forum next week to start talking about, okay, how do we bring this to life as a profession? But look, ultimately, I think we are trying to fill the void, which is, well, directors are saying, well, we do want to do the right thing. We do want to know that we are doing the right stuff. And if that means, if we're in a space where in a few years, let's say, heaven forbid, there's a fatality, and a director is going back, then look at this guide. I can show you how I'm doing everything in there that this guide is telling me I should be doing. That would be a great state for us, right? Because there is a lot in. We know that safety is a complexity issue, which means we will never be able to solve it. We will never be able to get to a risk-free point where we can guarantee fatalities can't happen. But if we're at a point where in a few years, every director, because they were worried about compliance, was actually doing what this guide now said to do, I don't think any of us would be complaining. And I do believe that we'd see better safety performance happening, however we want to measure it. So for me, I like the idea. I embrace the idea that this might become something, to Craig's point, of a Trojan elephant, which people run hard towards. But in doing so, they won't be able to, if they are trying to show how they're doing it, they won't be able to do a tick box exercise, because the nature of what is described in there is not a tick box exercise, right? It says you must learn and develop yourself, right? Well, that requires active effort all the time. It says you've got to monitor and verify. Great. But you can't just tick a box, because the guide actively says, be curious about work as done. Think about, are your systems understood and being applied effectively? So, this, I think the guide is great, because I would love people to start trying to say, we're doing everything in there. That's my defense. But if they're doing everything that's in there, it will not be a compliance agenda that we'll be talking about, because the guide doesn't take you into that mindset.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's get into some of the details. I'm sure that people are itching to hear the TLDR of the guide, and my mind automatically went to page 19 of the guide, which is the diagram that you've used to kind of the guide on a page, so to speak, is the way that I've explained it to other people. In there, you talk about the what and the how, including those 5 C's. So do you want to just talk us through really quickly those core elements at the middle of this good practice guide?
Yeah. So basically, and I've already had one, and I've thought about it. I've already had one person say, "Did you have to do a triangle? We want to move away from triangles," but the triangle does work quite nicely. So we've got those foundational stuff. So we could talk all we like about principles and the 5 C's and all those kind of things, but if you don't have the right foundations in place to systemize some of that stuff, you're going to be running around in circles. So some of that's just normal, standard, good practice. You've got your board agendas. You've got an annual plan for your board. You've got an assurance program, all those kind of things that you need to have as a baseline. So that's the foundations. And then the principles are those activities that you need to be doing. So the foundations are we've called what you need. Then the principles we've called what you do. So that's about, okay, so what do I need to do? I need to, Chris mentioned there, learn and develop was one of the principles. So I need to make sure that I've got appropriate learning programs in place for my office. I need to make sure that I'm keeping myself abreast of latest information about health and safety. I need to make sure I know and understand what the reality of work is for people. So the principles talk about what you do. And then the 5 C's, which we talked about already, so being courageous, being curious, having care for your people. Those are the how you do it. And so it doesn't matter, again, it doesn't matter if you've got all these things in place, if you're not doing it in the right way. So that's about creating that environment where people can be open and honest and, so there's no secrecy around what's going on. There's no trying to hide things. And we get to surface the problems. And so many people talked about, always having green dashboards. So you've got to fear the green and you've got to embrace the red in your dashboards. And to do that, you've got to have that right behavioral stuff in place so people can keep doing it.
Mhm.
And at the top of a triangle is that vision, which is just really sort of encapsulates those 5 C's. Enter, the vision of governance is these courageous leaders having these curious conversations. And so you've got the basics that you need, build on those with the sort of things that you're doing. Think about how you do that, which is obviously a bit reflective for people. And if you do all those things, then you'll achieve that vision. That's kind of the intent of the model.
Mm-hmm. So within the framework, Chris, are there any parts of this that you think stand out? And they might stand out because you're just really glad that they're there now when they weren't there before. Or maybe standouts because you think that they're really high leverage. You think they're the few things that are going to make the biggest difference. Are there any standouts for you?
It's really hard because I think, Craig's description of the framework is a great one. And a framework works, right? Because it's a holistic entity. So
I knew you were going to say that.
You pull out one bit and they are this, and then you watch the rest of the framework not quite work, right? So that's it. Certainly for me, I think you look at those 5 principles and the hows. I'm really excited about those. Purposely because I think, back to that first insight I shared, that a lot of the officers we were talking to in New Zealand were confusing and conflating their duties at the PCBU. Mm-hmm. And if you look at those hows, they're very much about the governance duties. Now, the guide, we nicely played it as what does it look like if you're an officer, an executive management, a safety professional. So we played them through. When we talk about learn and develop, it's because we're hitting, front and center. You go to our legislation, first duty under due diligence is you've got to develop and maintain your knowledge as an officer on health and safety matters. Right. So let's put learn and develop up front. I love that. That makes absolute sense because if we're not progressively moving officers and executives' knowledge forwards in health and safety, then we're never going to make the inroads we want, right? There is still too much, if I'm really honest, of officers believing that they are fulfilling that duty of develop and maintain their knowledge by attending an annual legal services briefing where they are told, here are the 5 or 6 duties. Right. Yeah. That is not going to work and certainly in my mind, that's not what good practice is. So I love that this is pushing harder into what is your forward-looking 2-year plan of safety development for you as an officer? That's a nice kind of question. The theme throughout all of it, is curiosity about work as done. Curiosity about, are you actually understanding the realities of operational work? I really like across those principles that we've got a theme of, you're seeing human performance come through. So a recognition that our people face complexity on a day-to-day basis. They are dealing with multiple resource constraint challenges. And so when stuff goes wrong, it's going wrong because they've done what they felt was the right thing, but they've been constrained at the time and made decisions that in hindsight don't look like the best one. Mm-hmm. That is front and foremost. So I think that's great. One of the things I'm really, really pleased about in the guide, it kind of comes through in that monitor and verify space, is actually the push away from lagging indicators. So, Craig and I had a number of discussions. this is something we were really interested in. New Zealand's regulator hasn't come out before and said, hey, TRIFR, LTIFR, stop using them. This is the first formal guidance where actually you will see that front and foremost where the guide says, move away from these lagging indicators to things that actually inform you about, performance better. So those are certainly a few of the things that when I think across the framework as a whole, that I think make this a step forwards, that I think reflect where we are. But I don't think you can pull out any one and say that one there is the thing that will make the difference, because everything else is pinned around the totality.
I think from a safety nerd perspective, as Chris said, a theme that comes through, the one that I like most in there is that complexity piece. So I think that's something that we really underdo in safety. We treat problems as if they're simple or complicated rather than complex. And we haven't gone into a whole deal of complexity science in there, but we just use word, and I think these are your words, Chris, which is about the messiness of normal work. So I think just that kind of phrasing and that kind of emphasizing that contextual piece and the complexity, I think is really important.
And I think that the word that's kind of, again, coming to me as we're talking about this is the word permission. So it's okay to have permission to ask questions or to say, I don't know, or for you to accept that things are really messy. And I think that I think to some extent, people who aren't directors, I think, put directors on some kind of pedestal. And the irony is that most of the time, those people haven't had a lot of exposure to director. So they might be working through their executive, for example. But I've found that directors actually don't need a whole lot of permission to say, I don't know, or to get curious. But if you steer them just a little bit, it's a nudge in the right direction. It's not like turning them 180 degrees. Then they've got no problem heading down that pathway if they get a bit of a nudge. So I feel like this word permission kept coming up. It's not a word you used, but it's like this guide gives directors permission to go down a certain pathway or to satisfy their curiosity in a way that they have, or to actually stop a discussion in the sense that you kind of alluded to before, Chris, which is that confusion between the PCBU's duties and the officer's duties. And, I don't know that I've actually read anything in so few words that is so clear and impactful as what you've put in the guide there to capture that. And it's 4 words that you used in one of the governance principles that you described, which is noses in, fingers out. And I love that. And so kudos to you guys in the sense of being able to take some quite complex ideas and being able to communicate them in a way that's quite familiar. I can't see anyone not nodding when they go, okay, I get that. I get that, which means that people then have permission to, take the KPI out of the report, to shift the discussion away from where executive or where the health and safety person might be taking it because they think that it's actually not going in a useful direction. So any thoughts on that? Can you see people having permission to do things in different ways now because of this piece of work?
Yeah, no, I certainly can. I think, so back to the point Craig was making around the how, the kind of mindset, purposely putting in words like courageous and curiosity is that explicit nod towards you Baz might frame as permission, right? But okay, well, actually, this is giving me something I can fall back on because the guy now says, actually, I should be saying I don't know, or I should be curious about this, or actually, I'm sensing the conversation this way. Yeah. I now have something I can fall back on. So yeah, I absolutely do see that this gives permission. And I also do feel like I take your point, actually, and it's a really good one about often the impression of officers might be born out of a lack of agile interface and experience with officers. And therefore, I expect it to be like, when you spend all the time with board members, you realize that they're human. They have the same ability as many of the rest of us, but they're there for a reason. They're deeply skilled, curious, good people trying to do the right thing, whilst they balance 1,000,001 constraints as well, right? Health and safety is just one of many, many, many challenges the board members, directors, officers are grappling with. It's not, whilst it's our day-to-day focus, it's not their sole focus. So I think what they will often do is they will rely back and say, well, look, this is one of many things I'm grappling with. Where can I go to that gives me some level of reassurance that I'm not just making this up on my own as I go through this journey? The permission comes right now that we've got institute directors and Workday alongside it. And then maybe just for Anna, Craig, just on that, noses in, fingers out, I've got to give some credit there. I'm sure he'll tell me, not his framing it, someone else, but that's one of the many, many amazing contributions that Mike Codman brought to this. And Mike is, the reason we ran towards Mike, not just a seasoned, very, very seasoned safety leader and professional. He actually, for many years, has been the person delivering and shaping the health and safety governance training for the Institute of Directors. So he was a logical person to bring. And one of his many contributions, he said to us over and over, guys, governance is about noses in, fingers out. And it was just such a nice encapsulation of the sentiment of, what does governance look like?
Yeah. And when I work with sort of senior safety leaders, one of the things I say to them is that the more the board would want to get their fingers in, the less confidence they have in. So the amount of time they're interfering, that's a really good indicator for how well you're doing your job with them. Right. So
or they don't know what to do in the alternative. But either way, you've got a way to go.
Yeah. If the board are happy, they'll not be digging in too far. So, so it's really good barometer. I think on that permission piece, the self-assessment that we put in that associated with the guide as well, that allowed those conversations to happen between board members and between officers to say, are we doing these things right? And it specifically asks questions in a way that they have to answer. They can't just say, yes, we do that. They have to give examples and reasoning as to why they do that. And so I think that hopefully will open up some really good conversations around the board, not about the business, but about the board and how they work. And going back just to your point about LTIFRs and things, you got this concept, pluralistic ignorance, which it's quite difficult to define, but I don't think, I disagree with the norm, but I think everybody else agrees with the norm, and so I'm going to go with it. So that's the kind of the personal concept. And then it turns out that everybody else in the room is thinking the same thing. So everybody thinks they're the only one that's challenging, when actually everybody would like to challenge if somebody would surface it and give them that permission. So those kind of conversations, and I think that's exactly the thing you said, well, this LTIFR metric, it seems a bit rubbish. Yeah, but nobody wants to say that because they think everybody else. So that kind of self-reflective piece, I think is really important. So not only do you want to use the guide, but you want to ask yourself those questions as well to make sure that you are, surfacing some position.
Yeah, I love that. I learn something every time I have a chat with Craig, and the latest one I've learned, pluralistic ignorance. But I might just pick up on that sentiment that Craig kind of still pushed in on the noses in, fingers out, because the tension that this guide and the tension that governors have, right, is that what is the right level of in versus the right level of out. So you go back to Pike River, what was one of the key findings there? They weren't being curious as a board. They were saying safety is a management issue. We're about, much big picture things. They were getting, LTIFR type stuff. They weren't being really curious about, are our critical systems known about, understood, and being applied effectively? So there is a tension. I fully understand and agree with Craig's point. If you have board members who are all the time in at the detail, then that is not even a weak signal. That's a strong signal that you are not doing something right to satisfy that curiosity. But you don't want to go the opposite end of the spectrum, which is then, hey, if your board aren't asking you any questions and they're never challenging you, then you must be doing everything right. Because actually, and I think Baz is maybe where you are heading, which is, well, actually then it's either maybe a cultural issue, a capability issue, but something is actually mean that they might not be doing enough. And so the tension is always trying to find that balance between how much is the right level of in versus out. And I think the guide at least goes a way to saying, well, the right level of in is certainly not just receiving reports that are green across the board, doing a safety share or a safety moment at the start, and then thinking you've done due diligence, right?
Yeah.
The guide very clearly says, how are you learning and developing? How are you getting out and understanding the realities of messy work? How are you challenging your organization when they are presenting you with maybe investigation summaries that are blaming human error and stopping there? The guide calls out and says, do not accept human error as an explanation for why bad things have happened in your organization. So I guess I was just picking up that point because I wouldn't want a listener to go away from this imagining that what we or the guide are saying is, if they're in it, the detail, something's wrong. But if they're not, then the world is good. It's absolutely not that. There's a tension there that you have to surf and navigate with them. But it's not about passively sitting back and just being a recipient. But it's definitely also not, hey, I want to tell you how as an organization you need to manage this risk. That's the level of tension. Is that fair, Craig?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And in the final 5 minutes, I think that kind of helps us land the plane on this discussion, which is about, so what next? And so some of my reflections as an outsider, so let's call me one of those people in one of those groups who would be a consumer of this information. I look at it and it is thoroughly actionable in terms of being able to guide next steps. You mentioned before that there is a short guide, there's the full document, and then there's the self-assessment. So awesome first next steps for people to be able to take to make sense of this. And I also personally was reflecting on the opportunity that this guide, I don't know whether it just draws me in or whether it's just like so cleverly written and compiled, that it actually encourages a level of sense making. So when I'm looking at this, I automatically think, okay, well, take care, for example. That's not the normal kind of thing that we would hear or talk about or maybe be comfortable with. So if that's the case, how are we going to have those conversations? What kinds of barriers, objections, fears are going to be coming up in the stakeholders who are involved in turning these ideas into practice? You mentioned curiosity a few times, and then the practice of that. How do we keep our noses in, which means that we will be involved in at least observing operations, but without, rolling our sleeves up and feeling like we've got to come up with 5 corrective actions each time we do a leadership walk, So I appreciate that you've really helped me, at least as a reader, to look at this and not just say, this gives me all of the steps to follow, but to go, okay, well, how am I going to make sense of this in practice, in particular, where there might be frictions that I need to think about. And for a lot of health and safety professionals, I certainly know that there's a lot of learning to do, especially when we think about things like context and complexity. So for one, I would like to say thank you to you guys and the people you represent who've been involved in this process. Any final reflections from you for people on using the guide and taking action?
I was going to say, I think so firstly, thanks, Baz. Great feedback, Rare. And it has landed well with people, which I think is the sign of a good piece of work. And I think Craig's done an awesome job of navigating from messy framework and models to what's a sterling output. And he and I will work it up until the last minute. The thing I think in terms of turning it into like an actual next step is recognizing that actually success for this is not that a bunch of safety professionals are off doing a bunch of new stuff. That's part of it. Fully agree. Success of this is the coalition of directors and governors and those who run organizations are now themselves saying, this is how I want to operate when I'm coming together and having governance conversation. So the practical action is, how do safety leaders work with their boards and their executive teams to actually create a strong sense of why? Why do I want to go from a current state to a future state that is different to where I am now? Whenever I have to change my way of being, that's effort, that energy, or I could just stay the same. And so, safety people just picking this up and running towards a board and said, this is the way, will probably only last, for a certain amount of time, if much at all. So I think that the opportunity for us as a profession is to think, how do I partner with those that my role is there to support, governors and executives, and create a sense of burning platform from our current approach towards where I want to be? And some might already be a lot closer to that, which is amazing. But I think the practical application actually comes from figuring out how I create a why to change for those that I'm supporting and get them to shape that why, as opposed to, hey, I've got a new guy as a safety person, my board reports are going to start looking a bit different in a few months' time. That's great. It could be a good step forward. You've not created that sense of change that I think is necessary at the audience this is primarily targeted towards.
Nice. Craig, final thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of using it, I think there's a quote in there somewhere we say that the quality of your governance is directly related to the quality of your conversations. And what I want safety leaders to do is have good conversations around this stuff with their boards and with their executive management. And based on that conversation, think about what your priorities are, where you need to focus your attention, what you need to improve on. What I don't want people to do is go away and go, okay, I've got these principles, turn that into an audit, and then go down and say, yes, we're doing all these. We've got 80% score against the governance down. Don't do that. Just go and have a good conversation and use it as a guide.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're using the same tools that you used to be using to do this thing, then you're probably not fully maximizing its potential. Guys, thanks again for the work that you put in on this, for your true leadership and vision in this space. This is certainly material that, in the context of performance-based legislation systems like in Australia and the UK and Canada and other places, I certainly haven't seen exists. So in that sense, New Zealand and the work you've been doing is leading the way. So thanks, Chris and Craig, for joining us on the Safety on Tap podcast.
Good guidance material speaks for itself. It stands alone in the way that it justifies its relevance. It helps the reader make meaningful progress on the problems within its pages. And I think most importantly, it's worthy of sharing with others. It isn't isolated, however, because good guidance is shaped with empathy for its audience and gets situated in the real-world context, inside which it's trying to be helpful. This is a good piece of work, and it's arguably the best guidance of this kind for Australians as well as New Zealanders. I have only one takeaway for you today. Download a copy, read it a few times, and see where it stimulates ideas and actions for you to take to improve governance inside your organisation. I promise you will get a lot out of this to help make things better. I've linked to the safety governance guidance materials in the show notes, which you can access over at safetyontap.com/EP222. And a couple of other episodes you might appreciate listening to off the back of this one are episode 118 with Wade Needham. That'll get your cogs turning, especially about what we can do to reframe the way that we're working and thinking about safety as a byproduct as opposed to something we directly work on, which I think fits beautifully within this new governance guidance. That's available at safetyontap.com/EP118. And episode 161 about Maslow's hammer. When all you've got in your hand is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. My assertion is that many health and safety professionals use too few tools to try and drive change. Things like compliance or just management systems or just risk management. This new guidance is going to help you use governance as a new tool in your hand to more effectively enable all of that good stuff to happen. That's available at safetyontap.com/EP161. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, what's the one thing you'll do to take positive, effective, or rewarding action to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way? See ya.